Dysphoria. While there's so much talk today about transgenderism, there's very little talk about the underlying condition that opens people up to the transgender delusion. It's this condition called gender dysphoria. Now, if you look up gender dysphoria, you'll find it defined as the feeling of discomfort or distress that might occur in people whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth or sex-related physical characteristics. Now, you can already tell that this is a very politically correct definition because obviously sex isn't assigned at birth. It's merely observed and documented. And even in cases regarding hermaphroditism, when sex isn't immediately obvious, it can still be determined because even hermaphrodites are still more so one sex than the other. But it goes on to say transgender and gender nonconforming people might experience gender dysphoria at some point in their lives. So they're making an association between transgenderism and gender dysphoria, but they're not going so far as to identify gender dysphoria as the underlying condition that either causes transgenderism or opens people up to that delusion. So that's gender dysphoria. But let's look up a different condition. Let's look up dysmorphia. If you look up dysmorphia definition, you'll see deformity or abnormality in the shape or size of a specified part of the body. But if you scroll over to the right, you'll see this. It says body dysmorphic disorder, also called BDD or body dysmorphia. The overview says a mental illness involving obsessive focus on a perceived flaw in appearance. So obviously, body dysmorphia is very different from the general definition of dysmorphia, which is referring to a physical condition, and this is identified as a mental illness. And it goes on to say the flaw may be minor or imagined, but the person may spend hours a day trying to fix it. The person may try many cosmetic procedures or exercise to excess. People with this disorder may frequently examine their appearance in a mirror, constantly compare their appearance with that of others, and avoid social situations or photos. And I want to share a clip of someone speaking about their experience with body dysmorphia. Now, this clip comes from Film Courage, which is a channel that does interviews with screenwriters and other people working in the film industry who share their stories and give advice to amateur writers. So he's speaking in the context of writing vulnerable, flawed characters, but this is a true story about his experience with body dysmorphia.
And that's all we do as story teachers, is we ask you, what's the wound of your hero? And how does that wound, how do they compensate for that wound at the beginning of the story? Because that compensation are your scenes. Here's an example. I had a wound when I was a teenager. My mommy didn't love me, and so because of that, I had body dysmorphia. I thought my lips were the size of Mick Jagger, and that was how my core wound manifested itself. So you can say, well, so what, Peter? That's for a therapist couch. But the way it manifested itself in my life was I hid in a bathroom to eat lunch. I wouldn't kiss a girl during the day. I wore white chapstick, all to hide my lips. I stopped playing the saxophone. Each one of those compensations for my core wound is a great scene in a movie. You gotta go into what wounded you and what you're doing in secret to compensate for that. We all have secret lives, and they're all about compensating for our wounds. That's the action that will make a great story, whether it's film or television.
Now, watching that clip, you might have been thinking, what lips? But that's the point. You have to remember that body dysmorphia can concern minor or even imaginary characteristics, It's a delusion. So if you connect all of the dots, transgenderism is based in gender dysphoria, and gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia are the same general psychological disorder. Now, you probably won't see, hear, or read anyone else explicitly drawing those connections because it would be politically incorrect to do so. Pointing out those connections would be considered hate speech today because it would be perceived as invalidating the experience and or identity of transgender people. But if you research all three, that being body dysmorphia, gender dysphoria, and transgenderism, I think the connections are relatively easy to see.